Hi there, welcome to week 7. The topic of this week is the countryside or the essential countryside, part of the landscape, well, the dominant part of the landscape, but yet the part that was frequently ignored by archaeologists in the past as important for understanding past cultures and human dynamics. But as I hope you will see in this presentation and from your readings, that it's not an empty space, and it has a lot to offer us with respect to understanding past cultures. There's some new vocabulary in your reading, and I wanted to make sure to point it out to you. I say a lot of Greek words, I know, in my presentations, and your readings include a lot of Greek words, and that's just part of understanding classical archaeology. I think it's partly because of the past, and it's the basis of revering Greek culture has led scholars of past generations to adopt Greek words. Excuse me. And so it's sort of something we're stuck with now. Never mind, it always helps to increase our vocabulary, doesn't it? Anyway, some important words in these readings are Atsu, which is a Greek word for town, Kora, which is a Greek word for the countryside, Herms or Hermes. Actually, they're the same. When we refer to boundary markers, they're often referred to as Herms, but these boundary markers are governed, or the effigies are represented are the god Hermes. So they're sort of one and the same. Polis, the Greek word for a city, which includes an urban and an extra-urban component, i.e. those first two vocabulary words, the Atsu and the Kora. Adim, which is a Greek word for village, a village that's associated specifically with a polis. Komai, which is a Greek word for village in the countryside, usually lies some distance from an Atsu. Your readings for this week bring to your attention the various things in the landscape which reflect human dynamics. And here I've composed a list of things that they mention. I may have left some out. And I would also, I'm also going to show you some examples of these things. In fact, most of them. I think I might omit one or two, maybe even three, but most of them I'll be showing you some examples of what your authors mean. Where possible, I'll show you examples of the specific sites that they mention, and if they haven't mentioned them, or if visual aids are not available for those sites, I'll give you alternatives. So aqueducts, most of you know what those are. Farmsteads, field boundary markers, I just mentioned those in the last slide with vocabulary. Herms or Hermes, right? Grave terraces, mines, quarries, roads, sanctuaries, shrines, terraces, tombs, villages, villas, walls, and wells. So let's have a look at some of these. I could show you pages upon pages upon pages and pages of Roman aqueducts. Romans were great aqueduct builders. So these are just 3 kind of random samples, to be perfectly honest, just so you have a vision in your head of what aqueduct means. The top right one is probably one of the more famous ones in southern France near the city of Nîmes. It's the Pont de Gare. The one on the left is kind of interesting because actually what I'm showing you in this picture is both an aqueduct and a viaduct. And this is kind of important because I don't know that they mention viaducts in your readings. So viaduct, so basically a bridge, a passageway through, over a landscape, which is the top part. And the aqueduct itself is this bit here filled with water that you'll see goes through a tunnel at the end. Farmsteads. So sometimes they're difficult to identify in the landscape, but when your authors refer to especially the Dima house and the Vari house and the farmstead at Lagrena, Palaya Cuprasia. So here are the plan. On the left, I'm showing you here the ground plan for the Dima house. And in the center is the ground plan for the Vari house. You can see there are similarities between the two in the way rectangular structure and divided into certain rooms, especially this end of the house looks very familiar. I mean, similar to both of them. One thing we see in the Vari house, though, are these holes, which probably held columns. And then finally, there's a reconstruction here at the one at Lagrena. Sorry, I'm very coffee today. Which is interesting. So we think that, it was laid out more or less as shown here in the picture. So one of the things I'm would like to tell you is to compare this reconstruction to the the map on page 131 of your classical archaeology readings and see what you think. Does it look like the plan there? Herms or Hermes. So this is kind of an important visual. It's like, oh, that's what you mean by boundary marker. That's right. As I told you that they're kind of one and the same. So it's representations often of the god Hermes, which you have here. I think Hermes is not always identifiable, and some of them don't necessarily look very Hermes-like, especially those. But this is a common practice. We, of course, not found them all in the landscape, but it's interesting that we also, there are images on pottery that show Herms and even show them being set up or created. So yes, they're basically these posts that somebody would encounter as, aha, this is a line, this is a boundary. And there's no body, but it's a post sort of topped with the head and a phallus. Now, if you'll notice in this picture, these gentlemen or these Herms are missing their phalluses or phallusi. The reason is well, simply we have literature that attests to naughty boys in the ancient world that would get together with all their friends. You know, like in the 1950s, you hear stories about bad boys getting together and causing trouble, and they go around knocking people's mailboxes down and stuff. Well, there's evidence to say that people sometimes would bad boys would get together, and sometimes this would happen after people behaved badly in symposia and drank too much, which they were never supposed to get drunk, but they did. And they went out and caroused, and one of the things they did was to knock the phalluses off the boundary stones, and that was a really bad thing. They were very naughty. But anyway, so that's one of the reasons why they're missing their phalluses. And the phalluses is basically, the Romans used phalluses in the same way. It's interesting, at the site of Pompeii especially, you see a lot of statuary with big, giant, erect penises. And it's, in the Roman context, it's meant to be good luck. But I think it's also a way of warding off evil in both these cultures, a way of threatening, with super testosterone-ness. Mines. I have a super short clip. It's a video that I want you to watch just to get a feel for what these mines were like. So Greek citizens, your readings especially refer to Greek mines at Lorien and Thorikos. And Greek citizens didn't really take part in actually the mining. It was mostly slave labor that was used. So there's a just a less than 2 minute clip, which is meant to entice you to watch a full episode, hour-long episode of a PBS documentary on the mines. But I think the 2 minute clip is enough, personally, to get you an idea of the kind of conditions that these slaves were exposed to in extracting silver, which from these mines. So on the left here, these two are depictions of the mines at Thorikos. And these right three pictures, the top one with the map and the bottom two are examples of certain spaces at the Lorien silver mines. I think it's interesting to also show you this picture in the middle, which is a Corinthian, like a tile, and that shows, has an image of what it would have been like if people were working in the mines, him hammering away. This guy here collecting the debris or the rock that he's chipping away, and then handing it to this guy potentially who's going to lift it up to somebody who leans over to collect the basket of things. And meanwhile, we have an oil lamp of sorts that's going to help them see in the dark. Quarries are in the landscape. I think these are great images, and I've also extracted images specifically from the sites mentioned in your readings. Mount Hymetos, this is an example of Mount Hymetos quarry, which is actually right near Athens. And then the ones on the right are the island of Paros and the Cyclades. They're part of the Cyclades in the Aegean. And so these are both different kinds of marble. Roads. Again, I could have shown you pages upon pages upon pages of roads. But that's not my goal here. My goal here is to just expose you, give you a glimpse. The one on the left here at the bottom is an example of a Greek road. The two in the middle are example of Etruscan roads. You can see the bottom one, which cuts right through the landscape. And the top one actually lays stone, which is why it's endured for so long. And then the ones on the far right, of which are much more prevalent in the landscape today, are Roman roads. So I especially was interested in showing you some roads that would be found in the countryside, not necessarily in a city setting. The Greek road was more in a settlement area. You can obvious from the debris around, but you can see how certainly the two Roman roads and the top road, the two Etruscan roads and the top Roman road are all sort of roads you might encounter in a landscape situation. Sanctuaries. I'm just showing you the one that was referred to specifically in your reading, which is Argive Heraion, which is a temple to Hera, showing you the remains of that temple. Not only the temple, but all other temples often had other associated architecture. So the bottom right picture is an artistic reconstruction that was made by about 100 years ago. Shrines, a shrine can take many forms, but your authors refer to shrines to Zeus on mountain summits. And for that reason, I've shown you these two photos on the left of the sanctuary of Zeus at Mount Lycaon in Arcadia. Arcadia, by the way, can also be spelled Arkada, which is the Greek spelling of the word, and that's the way you have it spelled in the article that you're to read this week about herding. Often in classical archaeology, not only do you get lots of Greek words, but you get words that can be spelled both from Latin perspective and from a Greek perspective and from a modern perspective. Sometimes it's problematic for researching sites because you have to do searches for both a Greek spelling and a Latin spelling. Sometimes you need to even start, with something like a Wikipedia search so that you can see what a common spelling is today, or name for a specific place or region, and then also see potentially how it might be spelled from the Greek or Roman perspectives. Anyway, sorry to go off on that. So there on the left are sanctuaries of Zeus. On the right here is one of the many examples of cave shrines for Pan. Often you see them on mountain slopes and in cave settings. Lots of times we have shrines for nymphs in spring settings. So I'm going to show you a few springs in this presentation as well. Tombs. Really, I could have gone through pages of this one too, especially over the millennia. Tombs ranging from the Neolithic period to the Bronze Age to the Iron Age to from the Greek lands to Roman lands, etc. So, this is a random sample. I tried to imagine what one might encounter in the landscape. The truth is, you can encounter anything. Sometimes very opulent tombs. The Romans often built tombs along roadsides. But when they started to occupy foreign lands, such as lands in Egypt or in the Far East, they tended to use some of the styles or ways of burial that were that reflected local customs as well. So you won't always see them in the same way. So here's a few pictures. Just these far three in the right are all different possible Roman tombs that one might encounter in the landscape. And quite honestly, I have not at all given you the whole range of variation. In the left are tombs that you might find in Greek landscapes. Most of these are quite early in date. Villages. It's hard to show you a village. I might have shown you a ground plan for the Etruscan colony, perhaps of Marzabotto, but I think I'll save that for our week on colonization, which is going to be week 14, colonization. Marzabotto. But it's really just what we see are floors and foundations that tell us the shape of these structures. So this is one of the many, many, many examples that you might find in Rome. This particular region in the Cavallina Valley in northern Italy, it's near Milan. They're particularly proud of their little Roman village. So they have a whole museum set up just so that you could go and look at the floors and foundation stones. Villas. Most villas are not still, extant. They're not, the walls are no longer erect. And all we get of those as well, usually, are the foundations. So here are three random villas. This one is an early Etruscan villa, Villa Vitalonia. And the one in the middle is a Gallo-Roman villa found in modern Luxembourg. And on the far right, here's a Roman villa found in southern Britain. They're all over the landscape, throughout the areas conquered by the Romans. This is not a Greek phenomenon. This is something that does date as far back as the 5th century in a Etruscan context. It's something that becomes particularly popular. It starts in about the 1st century BC for the Romans and really just goes crazy in the 1st century AD, 2nd and 3rd, as landowners sort of gobble up the lands and have these large, industrial farms. Walls, yeah. I mean, really, I'm like, what wall do I show them pictures of? So again, I'm trying to focus on things one might find in the landscape. As you walk along, you're like, wait a minute, those are stones piled up in a certain way. So this is an example of a Greek wall, and below is an example of an Etruscan wall. And in the top right is one of the most famous walls of all. This is Hadrian's Wall, which cuts across the British Isles at the top, more near the boundary between England and Scotland. One giant wall that spans the landscape. Wells. Wells are a common thing. They're not always recognizable. Imagine what this one on the top right would look like if we didn't still have, this structure of the well, and if it was only, and if a bit of dirt is filled in. They can, hide really well in the landscape. So I've chosen ones that, are more obvious so that you can see what they would have looked like. So they come in all shapes and sizes, but everyone needs water, right? My next topic is going to be referring specifically to your readings. So if you're watching this prior to reading, you're doing your reading assignments, you might want to pause here. It's going to make a lot more sense. All of my slides from here on will make a lot more sense once you've done the reading. Because what I've done is taken, your readings offer you a variety of things, and I've given you questions on some of the topics in your readings, but the readings in the classical archaeology book, both of the two parts of the chapter focus one section on the chronology and dynamics in the landscape. And so what I'm giving you here is a side-by-side comparison as to what's happening in the Greek landscape and the Roman landscape simultaneously, not separately the way they've done the readings. I've left out lots of information, trying, for brevity's sake, give you something that will be helpful for study rather than teaching you entirely this topic, if that helps. So really, this will be, work a lot better if you've already done these readings. So if you've done the readings, then let's go forward. It will make, like I said, much more sense. So the first slide I'm showing you deals with the very early time period, and I've extracted what information your authors give you for this very early time period. Your author on the Greek countryside talks a little bit about the Dark Age. The Roman countryside dabbles with the Late Bronze Age and then goes on to the Early Iron Age. So we can see that while in the Greek countryside you have a general decline, well, actually rather sharp here is what I say, and what your author says, of any rural presence compared to the Bronze Age. And we sort of knew that, I think, already from some of the past readings, especially your section on history and prehistory. So we had a flourishing Bronze Age, which you've learned from our section on the Bronze Age, which ended, rather abruptly in about 1450 BC. And we don't really see much activity in the landscape at all at that point. If any activity is happening in a Greek landscape, it's happening definitely at the coastal regions. We certainly have evidence on the island of Euboea at the site of Lefkandi, but also we know that that the Bronze Age site of Athens continues as well. The Roman countryside during the same period of time, early on, at the end of the second millennium, sees a series of small settlements spread out. And within these settlements lives a warrior elite. We have a society that is now stratified permanently fixed in that way, but it's not. There's not a huge disparity between the different stratified classes. The differences are not overly emphasized. So, in other words, we don't get, on the one hand, a princely graves, and on the other hand, graves where there are no grave goods or markers, etc. So there's not a huge difference. You'll find there are those that graves that are clearly more bestowed more generously with grave goods, and some that are not. In the early Iron Age, following the period I was just discussing, there starts a trend towards centralization and nucleation of sites. So because of that, we see that many of the villages are abandoned. We think that people are moving from these abandoned villages into settlements that are becoming more greatly populated, that will eventually grow into towns. The following period mentioned by both of your authors is the Archaic period, and I've given you the dates at the top here, 750 to 480 BC. In the Greek countryside, we see the increase of populations during this time. Small settlements arise in the countryside where things had been, silent and vacant right after the Bronze Age. It's starting to, a period of florescence has begun. We see the rise of the polis. So that means that some of these settlements, especially settlements like Athens, are becoming urban. We're seeing the beginning of urbanization. We see the appearance of rural sanctuaries. Some are very, very important and large and monumental. For example, the Heraion of Argos, which is a site that I've already shown you before in a previous slide. On the Roman countryside, small isolated farms appear, but we also see the appearance of luxurious elite residences. The example mentioned in your text is at the site of Merlot. I've given you a couple of images here. This is the earlier image of what the reconstruction of what they think the site looked like in the 7th century. But it's interesting to note that when you look at the 6th century example I have in the bottom right, that the site changes and becomes more and more luxurious, larger, more structures. There's this big central courtyard looking something much more like what would become a villa. This picture on the top right is from a local museum there, which shows some of the acroteri, i.e. the statuettes, the sculptures that are placed on the rooftops. In the 6th century example down at the bottom, you can just barely see that along the line there and along the line at the top, you can barely see it. They're all different kinds of statuettes. Do you remember those hut urns, right? Those hut urns and along the roof line, now those hut urns we saw like birds. And I also talked to you about Etruscan temples and how they have those acroteri. And here we also are using these rooftop acroteri at this early period. So moving forward in time to the classical period, 480 to 323, in the Greek countryside we see an intensification of archaic trends. So this filling up of the countryside, the emergence of the polis intensifies. We see intensification of quarry site use. This is definitely as a result of the building projects that are happening at Athens. We see increased exploitation of mineral and metal resources. Think, in particular, those mines in Greece, like the Laurian mines that I showed you earlier. This is what some of the funds that Athens is generating to do all these building projects. We see raiding of agricultural resources in the landscape by Spartans as a result of the war between Athens and Sparta, the Peloponnesian War. We see the utilization of marginalized or previously unutilized lands. This seems to correspond with an efflorescence of small sites in the peninsula, especially into areas that were suitable for olive cultivation. At the same time, in the Roman countryside, we see small farms slowly expand. Lower classes have just recently, due to uprisings and a social war, been empowered by new Roman laws to work their own land, no longer in servitude. Elite members of the population, however, turn their focus and are encouraged to do so to urban centers rather than being their own little lords in the landscape. They're encouraged to make their fortune by participating in local politics and so forth. So it's a different way than things were done in the past. So Rome continues its militaristic actions and perspective and conquers all its neighbors and beyond. But once they've done that, they're trying to merge their own ideas of landscape organization with indigenous patterns. That's something you'll definitely hear more about, not only in your classical archaeological readings, but also in your readings by Stephen Dyson. So over time, throughout this period, there's an increase in agricultural surplus. And this is also the time when we see the very first villas in Etruria. Your author gives an example of the auditorium site, which is an Etruscan villa, perhaps something that has graduated beyond what we saw at Merlot in the previous period. Here in this picture, I'm showing you a plan and also an aerial view of the excavated site. Notice that if you're confused why the aerial view does not match the plan is only showing the 5th century version of that site, whereas the excavations shows all the changes throughout all of time. Moving on to the countryside between the 4th century BC and the 2nd century AD. And when you're referring to the Greek countryside, you really are talking about 2 chronological periods of development, whereas in the Roman countryside, you have a consistent flow from throughout time. In the Greek countryside, we certainly see a drop-off in human activity in general. One of the reasons may be the warfare and turmoil that came in the wake of the Peloponnesian War. We also see a shift in land ownership from citizen farmers to concentrations of land held by the few. This is also the same sort of trend that's happening in the Roman countryside at this time. We see in both especially in the Roman countryside, you're seeing the increasing popularity of the villa which becomes an industrial farm owned by the elite, which is in charge of large tracts of land. So it's very similar to what's going on in Greece at the same time, with that increased concentration of land into a few hands. So according to your readings on the Greek countryside, that this concentration of land held by few is marked by ornate, imposing rural residences and elaborate tombs. That's exactly what's going on in the Roman countryside at the same time. So it's interesting that that both areas are experiencing a similar dynamic at this period. One example of this kind of large rural residence that is the center of an industrial agricultural elite landholding farm is the villa site of Sede Finestra, and which literally means seven windows. And so here is a reconstruction model of the villa at Sede Finestra, and in the bottom here are some of the remains of Sede Finestra, and on the right is a plan of the site. The countryside during the later Roman era, circa about AD 300 to 500, whereas again, like the previous era, seeing more and more in common between these areas. The Greek countryside, however, sees a reemergence of some numerous small sites in addition to those large land holding sites and villas that are also now in the Greek countryside. We're wondering why that's happening in the Greek countryside, why we have the reemergence of some of those smaller sites. And it may well have to do with big political restructuring of the empire itself. The new imperial capital is now in the east. It's no longer in Rome, it's in Constantinople. Greece is much closer to this capital, and perhaps is far more necessary for supplying this capital of its needs. In the Roman countryside, we see the villa construction spreading throughout the provinces. I've already shown you examples in Britain and Gaul and Luxembourg. One example of late provincial villa is one on the island of Sicily. Throughout this period, they're not only spreading in popularity, they're spreading in terms of size of individual villas and in terms of decoration. They're much more flamboyant, ever so. It's almost as if they're having a villa competition worldwide. So this particular example in Sicily, near the town of Piazza Armerina, most people refer to it actually as the Villa of Piazza Armerina, but it's actually called the Villa del Casale. And the top right shows a ground plan of this huge sprawling villa. And I also have here just a few examples of some of the extraordinary mosaics found throughout the villa. So we have all kinds of themes happening. This theme here, this is the story of Odysseus in Homer's Odyssey. This is, if we could get a better view, you'd see that this guy has a third eye in the middle of the head. In the Odyssey is the story of Polyphemus, or the Cyclops, aka the Cyclops. Here, the Cyclops has three eyes. I don't know. Normally, the story says he's got one, and this would be Odysseus. We also see themes of trade. You can see these ships on the island of Sicily. I suppose that's not surprising. And here's just a close-up of one of those one of the scenes in the shipping mosaic here, and trade, and look at they're loading an elephant. I think there's all kinds of exotic animals along here, and that's reflecting also another dynamic that's happening in the Roman world with respect to gladiator shows and the show of man versus beast and exotic animal collections. We also have some, like here, this particular mosaic here at the bottom left corresponds to this sort of courtyard area in the map at the top, the center place. And so we have a variety of floral and geometric decorations on the covered portion. And here would have been this area is called the atrium. So on the bottom is also a very famous mosaic. I think that scholars have jokingly named it the bikini bathers or something like that, but they're not bathing and they're not wearing bikinis. But if truth be told, it is the only example we have throughout the entire Roman world or Greek world of women wearing these kinds of clothes. The Romans and the Greeks were both very, very conservative with respect to women, and especially the Romans. So, yeah, we think it's perhaps it's meant to depict a fantasy imagining of Spartan women, and yet they chose to make sure that they were covered in important places. Spartan women are said to have engaged in various exercises, so perhaps that's going on. Or perhaps it's actually something, I don't know, that women could do together in private. And since most of our words, our history, or our accounts of Roman and Greek history come from men, perhaps we are just not privy to this particular activity. Anyway, so that's all I really wanted to say about those your readings in classical archaeology. I'm gonna just on your readings about Tending the Herds by Timothy Howe. I just want to offer you this one slide as a helpful hint. I felt that his discussion of herding and animal management and production was problematic because he didn't show you a map. And so here we are. Here's a map with the various regions of Greece. Thessaly wasn't on this map, so I kind of stuck it up here. It's, in fact, even where I put it is just a wee bit too low, but you get the general idea. So if you're looking to see where Attica is here, Thessaly, it's generally here, right? Arcadia, see, it's spelled with a C here, and I've spelled it with a K like the author, so be careful about that. It's the same thing. And for some reason, then he says Sparta rather than Laconia, and I'm not really sure why he does that. The Spartans were in charge, basically ruled over the region of Laconia and Messenia. So they dominated Messenia. Usually that was an area used for cultivation by slave labor, the Helots. So I've put a splash here at Sparta itself, just so that you understand. Maybe I should have put the word Sparta with an arrow, but I don't need to because now I'm talking to you and you can hear me. So anyway, that I thought would be helpful with your with reflecting on that reading. Now I want to just show you a few sites. I really like the Dyson reading. I like Steve Dyson. Steve Dyson is was my primary mentor in graduate school. He was not my dissertation advisor. My dissertation advisor was Ian Morris, whose name you see all over the place, cited in all of your readings. But Steve Dyson is a pretty extraordinary legend in archaeology as well. So I'm very proud to have had him as one of my mentors. So there's a few sites mentioned by him in his reading. You know, there was a limited budget publication. I'm sure he would have loved to have included pictures himself. So Pietra Bondanza is a site that's located in the indigenous area of the Samnites, which is one of the many Italic tribes on the Italic Peninsula. This is a sanctuary site, And it's interesting that sanctuary sites were often used as places of political intrigue, where competitors to Roman ideas might stage meetings and so forth. It achieved a high level of architectural monumentality. On its own, we can see this in the way of a theater, and also the religious structures that surround it. So here the aerial view, I think, is particularly helpful with this. It was attacked by the Romans, especially during the time of the Social War in the early 1st century BC. And those are bits of information that Dyson tells us about it in the readings. Clytemnestra is a interesting site in that it's beautiful. Number one, it has a spring, which there would have been donations to nymphs at the spring, but there's also a temple here, as you can see in the right. So it's an important site on a very local level. And that's one of the important things about spring sites in general, is it brings local people together in a common focus. And this particular site is located in Umbria, which is an eastern sort of province of Rome. Not of Rome, of Italy, sorry. Gournay-sur-Aronde, which is in France, or Gaul, if you were a Roman, provides us with an excellent example of a sanctuary site where the evolution can be traced from the Iron Age into the Roman period. So here we have a Celtic site underneath a Gallo-Roman temple. And below here I've shown you the image of a reconstruction of what the Celtic site would have looked like. Aquae Apollinaris at Vicarello is a beautiful site as well. You can imagine, that people in this area, saw this as a magical place with water coming out of the ground in the spring, magically, surely provided by nymphs, and built a cult around this, often, left offerings of thanks and requests for help to the deities that provided this. It's also an interesting site in that it has some pretty amazing offerings, especially in a way of these vessels here. This this particular one on the left, I've got showing you two different sides of it. This was an expensive piece in silver, and it was a piece of quality craftsmanship. Perhaps this is a nymph. Perhaps it seems to be perhaps made especially for this situation. But so are these, because Dyson tells you that these vessels, although Dyson says they're glass, and I'm not 100% sure that they are glass. Anyway, he says that these vessels basically provided directions to this site, and they did. And I think this particular map is a really helpful for understanding that. So the vessels make a list of stops and places, of landmarks on the way. And if you follow it, you get to where you're going. Pretty extraordinary, huh? Aquae Epistinae at Fordogianus, which is in the Tisa River Valley of Sardinia. This is a thermal spring, i.e., hot waters. And it's a really important place for a lot of reasons, other than the fact that it's special in that it's thermal. It's located on the boundary between Roman and native spheres, which made it especially important with respect to having a sort of neutral, special, sacred place where indigenous people, Sardinians, could meet Romans for diplomatic negotiations. It also became a curative bathing establishment later. So it's sort of one of the sort of spa sites that people would make pilgrimages to. Source de la Seine is a really cool spring site. Think of how amazing it is when water seems to come out of nowhere, and fresh flowing water. I mean, it seems like a gift from the gods. This one's super interesting because the damp soils preserved things that normally would not have been preserved, things made of wood. And so we also not only get the things made of wood, we get things done in a very Celtic manner. So it's kind of cool to see that both indigenous people and perhaps Roman people were frequenting the same sacred sites. And that's it for this week. I know that's under an hour. So hooray. And I look forward to connecting again with you. Next week, we're going to talk about many things urban. That's it. Bye.